Alright, so today I'll be talking a little bit about food sovereignty, specifically in the Oneida community of Wisconsin. So before I go right into talking about food sovereignty, I really want to take a minute to talk about why it's important to Native communities today by talking a little bit about community health and what that means. Community health encompasses a lot of components like physical, mental, spiritual, and environmental health, which are all really closely connected. So the converging effects of one or many of those areas of health can profoundly impact the quality of life and futures for Native communities. Some specific examples of health disparities that we can see in Native communities today would include increased risk of diabetes, obesity, as well as mental health concerns like depression, alcoholism, and suicide. The environments many Native communities live in are also disproportionately affected. These issues, coupled with the generational trauma from generations of colonialism, also have really important implications for the spiritual health of Native communities as well. Most of these issues are really deeply connected with the land and the ability to determine your way of living on that land. And before colonization, most Native communities had a really deep connection to the land and their environmental communities, and valued relationships of gratitude, respect, and reciprocity with land and all of the community members living on it. Because of that, most Native communities were not experiencing those kinds of health issues until after European contact and after colonization, when they were forcefully separated from their land and their cultures and their histories. So the best way to address those kinds of issues that contemporary Native communities are facing today is to restore the self-determination that they had before colonization. So the food sovereignty movement is a movement towards restoring that self-determination, to create opportunities for Native communities to have a better future, really oriented to their own specific goals and their own specific needs. It's not an easy task, so food sovereignty really just is a general referral to a broad but connected set of issues related to the ability of Native communities to have great power over their health and their well-being and their connection to the land. So kind of generally speaking, the idea is that it's a return to a land-based food and political system that addresses intersecting issues of food insecurity, environmentally unstable production, economic inequality, and social and historical injustice. A lot of previous attempts to address food insecurity really focused on maximizing production and didn't focus on the source of the food or who would benefit from the production of the food. So this movement really seeks to empower communities by rebuilding their self-sufficiency. I would say the biggest challenges of achieving food sovereignty for Native communities would be trying to navigate the legacies of colonialism and the current public health and environmental crises that affect everyone, but really affect Native communities disproportionately. So food sovereignty is definitely not like a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. It's really specific to the challenges, goals, practices, and needs of specific communities. So to really understand the importance of food sovereignty, we have to look to specific communities and listen to their stories. In order to understand food sovereignty a little bit better, I decided to look to the Oneida community of Wisconsin and their journey. Just before European contact, the Haudenosaunee people, comprised of 5 and then 6 tribal nations, including the Oneida, lived on their ancestral homelands of around 6 million acres in what's now understood as New York. The Haudenosaunee people didn't just live on the land, they really lived with the land, and really valued the importance of community relationships, and not just with people, but with all members of their environmental community. When Europeans arrived, they brought with them a very different kind of relationship that they had with the land, seeing it as kind of an extractive source of wealth and a way to control resources. Haudenosaunee communities were able to coexist and even cooperated with a lot of early settlers, engaging in the fur trade industry and even siding with the United States during the Revolutionary War. Several treaties in this period recognized the sovereignty of the Oneida Nation, and the Canandaigua Treaty of 1794 actually promised to set aside 300,000 acres for fur. And the Non-Intercourse Act of 1790 amendments after that prohibited anybody from buying land or taking land from Native communities without the express consent of the federal government. Despite that, though, the state of New York continued to illegally engage in land exchanges until the 1820s, there was 32 acres left, which is less than 1/10 of a square mile. This push out of their homelands taught them to relocate to establish new homelands somewhere else. The Oneida were able to negotiate with the Menominee and other tribes living in Wisconsin at the time for land near Green Bay to re-establish their homelands there. There were some disputes about the size and the boundaries of the land that had been promised to the Oneida, which of course caused the government to get involved. At the end of the day, a reservation was established for the Oneida community to live in Wisconsin, but it wasn't anywhere near the size that they had been promised, and they were actually asked to relocate again shortly after that, west of Mississippi. Despite these challenges, the Oneida began to establish themselves and practice their traditional ways in their new homeland. This was further complicated by the government criminalization and regulation of nativeness as they continued to exploit and oppress communities under the justification of civilization. Policies aimed at assimilating Native communities were really just an attempt to eliminate them completely. Native communities are still trying to recover from these policies of assimilation today. The justification for assimilation was really based on this idea of the trust relationship, which was actually created by the U.S. federal government when it promised to help Native communities in exchange for land and resources. Ironically, the goal of assimilation policies was to eliminate the trust relationship altogether. The end of the Civil War gave a lot of momentum to the power of the federal government, as well as ideas of patriotism, which led to a lot more intense assimilation practices and policies. Two of these had a major impact on not only the Oneida, but all Native communities living in the United States. Boarding schools disguised as education separated communities and disrupted the flow of generational knowledge by literally stealing children from their families and communities. This, along with the mistreatment the children faced at the boarding schools, contributed heavily to the intergenerational trauma that Native communities are still grappling with today. The other major policy of assimilation that created lasting challenges for Native communities today was that of land allotment, and that was the forced adoption of individual land ownership instead of communal tribal ownership. Removal of tribal lands from trust also made land subject to tax laws, and more importantly, available for private sale. This opportunity was exploited by the government and other non-Native interests to gain control of tribally owned lands and to further displace Native communities across the country. Less than 100 years after relocating to Wisconsin, the Oneida community found themselves under the same pressure that caused them to relocate to Wisconsin in the first place. By 1917, there were only about 200 acres of the Oneida Reservation left in trust. These and other policies of assimilation sought to disconnect Native communities from their land and their cultures, and it also created a forced dependence on the government for survival and well-being. An example of the result of this forced dependence is the tendency of Native communities to then rely on commodity foods. These foods distributed by the government were often unhealthy and almost always culturally inappropriate for the communities they were distributed to. This system also really transformed the relationship Native communities had with the food that they were eating. Since they were separated from the land and the knowledge they used to produce their traditional foods before, the relationships with food became more transactional. And the longer these kinds of systems persist, the further separated these communities become. Despite these major challenges to self-determination, Oneida ways of life and communities persisted. The Oneida's deep commitment to and relationship with land stemmed from and perpetuated their traditional ways of being. They used this knowledge to embrace any opportunity they were given to restore health and power to the Oneida people and lands. Starting with Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the Oneida community of Wisconsin has been able to start the process of reacquiring the lands that were stolen from them. Through their continued efforts, the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin now owns more than 23,000 acres, and that number is still growing. Besides the historical effects of colonialism, Native communities also face the challenge of modern factors like climate change, pollution, and pandemics that add to those historical injustices and disproportionately affect Native communities. The United Nations recognized all of these factors and combined them into a framework for action to support community health through self-determination for their contemporary Oneida community. Their comprehensive approach to food sovereignty centers around 4 foundational goals that are focused on strengthening and connecting their food systems in order to create a system that's efficient and improves community health. Their first goal is an adaptable, resilient, and responsive food system that not only supports long-term community health, but is also responsive to changing conditions and community needs. Their second goal is recognition of food systems as being integral to the idea of community wellness, and also places importance on the participation by community members in those food systems. The third goal focuses on strengthening and expanding food system networks by giving the community members the resources that they need and able to produce food independently as well as to connect to each other. And their final goal is for this approach to serve as a model framework for other Native communities in their own food sovereignty journeys. A really important idea in this approach is the connectedness and the integration of all the parts of food systems that come together to support food sovereignty for the Oneida people. They have a ton of projects and programs, but I just picked a few to highlight here in order to show the scope and diversity of areas to support food sovereignty efforts. They're still prioritizing land reacquisition, and with that comes an increased dedication to land management and restoration of the lands they repurpose. These lands can be used by the nation and community to restore self-determination and empower food sovereignty. The community is also a leader in food production innovation, and they practice sustainable agriculture whenever possible. Since food system also centers around community participation, community outreach and education are also huge projects. They also go beyond food production by prioritizing distribution of fresh, locally produced for all Oneida tribal members. In order to enact lasting change for the future generations of the Oneida Nation as well as for other Native communities, the nation has also put emphasis on institutionalizing these initiatives and programs, which provides a mechanism different communities with different needs can use.